Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the Street Peace Coalition on Comcast Chicago Channel 21. We want to welcome you this evening. My name is Minister Michael Muhammad, one of the co-founders of the Street Peace Coalition. Unfortunately, our guest, our regular host, Johnny Muhammad, is not going to be with us this evening. He should be back with us next week. And so I have the responsibility of filling in for him this week. But on next week, we want you to come back so that he can complete the second part of his interview with one of our co-founders that he started on last week. We know that tonight is election night, and so I'm sure that many people are kind of glued to the screen or the radio trying to steal a hearing about what's going on with the election. And so in spite of that, we have to carry on with our messaging here on Comcast 21. Hotline 21. We want to encourage you to call in at 312-738-1060. That's 312-738-1060. You see that number at the bottom of your screen. You can call in at any time and we'll do our best to entertain your questions regarding the issue of violence in the black community and violence in Chicago. And so tonight, while everyone is looking at the presidential race and who will be the next president of the United States of America, we want to say a few things in the context of our mission as the Street Peace Coalition to provide violence intervention and violence prevention. And we have been working under the umbrella of the Street Peace Coalition since 2012, crafting an agenda, a strategy, a program, if you will, that is designed to be unique, unlike most other strategies that are being employed to deal with violence in our communities. And so we are a truly grassroots organization. As we've explained our origins before, we fund and finance ourselves. We seek no grants, no outside funding other than from the communities in which we serve. We are an outgrowth of Torchlight Interfaith Ministry and the outreach that we have traditionally done in that ministry to interact with the condition of violence in the community. And so we've created a completely independent group. And so we focus on violence. We focus specifically on black violence. And so it's an interesting paradigm that tonight, as I speak to you, people are looking at the presidential election and other elections, while right here in Chicago, as many of you know, there was a young man who was gunned down in Mount Greenwood, in the Mount Greenwood community, by an off-duty police officer, as the story goes. And so right now there is a tremendous protest going on in Mount Greenwood by members of the Mount Greenwood community in support of law enforcement. And so just as any other community has a right, we certainly, some of us exercise our right to demonstrate. They certainly have a right to conduct their own protests. And so what I want to talk about with the brief time we have on air tonight is I want to challenge us to think about violence in a different way. My views and opinions, my assessments, analysis, and perspective, I can assure you, are not politically correct. They're not common. They may be hard for most people to digest or really appreciate. Nevertheless, we know that they have weight, value, and import just the same. And so there has been a big debate in America over this last year or so between the Hillary camp and the Trump camp. And here in Chicago, that's been the backdrop to the aftermath of the Laquan McDonald fallout. And so as we enter into November, on last year, I was fortunate enough to be a part of one particular group, as there were about 4 different major groups that came together to organize the shutdown of the Magnificent Mile in Chicago after the release of the Laquan McDonald tape. And so the Street Peace Coalition participated in that shutdown, and we're entering into the anniversary of that historic demonstration. But we've been existing here in Chicago and the fallout of that, while the city administration, the mayor, as its leader, has been making moves publicly and privately to respond to the fallout of the Laquan McDonald drama, the murder and assassination of that young man. And so many people recently have forgotten about that issue and gotten caught up in the debate over Hillary or Trump. And so from the perspective of one who works on the issue specifically of violence, black on black violence, and really violence in general in society, it strikes me as odd that so many people in our community could put faith. It seems as though the majority of our community are supporting Hillary tonight in the election. And that just strikes me as so irrational, so illogical, so odd that our emotional reactions to things are so powerful that we're really willing to dismiss what the Clintons have done because we are afraid of what Trump is saying. And I think that, it's one thing to say things that are outrageous, that are hurtful. It's one thing to speak about what I might do if I was able to come into some level of power to implement something outlandish. But it's a completely different condition to look at me, say how much I care for you, but I have a long track record of doing everything possible to hurt you. And so this is a sophisticated process of thought that the power elite understand that most of us are not equipped to engage in, because we have been so dumbed down politically. We have been so dumbed down about what our best interests are. We have been so indoctrinated with party line about what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican, that as long as people speak the cold words that we have subliminally and sometimes consciously been programmed to respond in favor of, then we will respond in favor of whoever speaks that code language, even though if we look under the hood at their record, they have done everything possible to execute violence against us as a community. And so it is interesting to me, because what it suggests is that when the mayoral election comes around, our community, if our emotions are stoked and titillated enough, we will leave the protesters and run back to the man and the men and women in the city council who have perpetrated the worst kind of economic, educational, and social political violence against our community. We, as a people, we will never be able to solve the problems of violence until our minds, our hearts are capable of swallowing the truth, and not a half-truth, but the cold, hard reality of what produces violence in America. And so as the Street Peace Coalition, we have chosen deliberately, our mission is not to address police brutality, even though we are completely against police brutality. But our mission is to get our community to understand that we are responsible for what goes on in our community. And so our focus is on specifically black men, primarily black women secondarily, who have a history of influence, a history of being inside the mechanisms, the groups that drive violence inside of the black community, and we've focused our energy in that direction. And so tonight, I'm going to take this time to challenge those of you who may be looking at this and those who may see it later. I have a very critical question to ask our community. We are quick to respond to white on black violence, and we should be. We certainly should be. But at a deeper level, are we being honest? Are we being responsible as men, as adult men? Are we being responsible and truthful to have an honest discussion about the role we play in the violence that's going on in the black community? Now, I know this is a tough kind of line of talk, because it's easy to blame people external to ourselves, and most of us have been socialized in a way that it's hard for us to see our own fault, our own wrong. Most of us, as long as I can blame somebody else, it's his fault. It's not my fault, it's his fault. And no matter how many times there's a clash, there's an issue, the relationship is having problems or issues, it's always the other person's fault. No matter how many times you find yourself, in a precarious position, we've been socialized in a way that we've lost the faculty of self-perspective, self-analysis, and self-assessment. And so it's become so easy for black people to have a visceral reaction to people outside of the black community perpetrating violence, but we have a dull response. We're handicapped. We're at a loss. Our knowledge, our wisdom, our strategy, our training, our education is depleted when it comes to dealing with what we do to one another. But what we have to understand about that, the first thing we need to understand is this. Trauma is trauma. But the way we respond to trauma is different based upon the source of the trauma. So it amuses me that racists will say, why should we care about your demonstration about police murders and violence when you hurt one another? Well, on the surface, that's a good point. But this is what we've got. What amuses me about that is that many black people use that argument against other black people. some brown people, Hispanics, use that with other Hispanics. But here's the fault in that logic. Any one of you listening to me or looking at me who know anything about trauma, who know anything about trauma response, you know, and we could just look at it socially, that if I was on camera right now pinching myself or poking myself, well, you would get a laugh out of that. You would probably call the station and say, it's something wrong with that guy. He's hurting himself. Why is he doing that to himself? Well, in a general sense, if I was walking down the street poking myself or slapping myself, or you would know that something is wrong. You would know that I've suffered some type of trauma that's given me a mental imbalance that I would self-inflict or self-mutilate at one extreme. But at the same time, there's a certain level of self-trauma. There's a line there where you know that I have a right to do to myself what I so choose. And so the deep in this principle is the idea that a woman has a right to abort her fetus, because you have a right in your own self-being, even to the point of self-injury. That's an inalienable right that you have of yourself. So you can cut your hair, you can tattoo yourself, you can pierce yourself, which is a self-mutilation process. So it's tattooing. And I'm speaking from a mental health perspective now. You have a right to do these things within yourself, but it's a whole different kind of reaction socially when you see me inflicting those type of things that may be acceptable for me to do to myself when I impose that trauma on somebody else. So what we've got to understand is that black people have suffered a historical trauma that is really totally unmatched by any community of people in the history of human beings. And now we underestimate that trauma, but that trauma is at the root of our reactions, the different reactions we have from white on black violence or police violence versus black on black violence. So we need to understand that there's still, both reactions are rooted in the same trauma, but they are manifested differently because of the nature of the self and what is acceptable to the self versus what is allowable from someone outside of the self. Now, that may be a little, I'm saying that as plainly as I can, but I hope you follow my logic. Now, so having said that, what I want to challenge those of you listening to think about, we complain about violence, but just like this young brother, Joshua Bill, a young man who fit the stereotype of how we look, how we dress, how we act, how we roll, carrying a weapon. He had a concealed carry, but it was illegal in Illinois. Imposing his will in front of a fire department. And being asked to move. And then the reaction leads to his murder. But what I want to do is dig into that very quickly. Let's be honest, black men and women in specific. How much antisocial, undisciplined behavior have we sanctioned in our community? Now, I'm not trying to justify what happened to my brother, but I'm trying to get us to look at ourselves. Because I work with young and old. We work with young and old. We're in the community. How much have we degraded the sense of decorum, protocol, self-respect, carrying ourselves with dignity? How much have we allowed our young men to feel as though they don't have to respect anybody, including themselves? How much of this do we encourage? How many mothers encourage their sons or allow their sons to leave the house with, with the wildest, grimiest look possible? How many mothers are out there that have sons right now with bags of weed in the house, pistols, guns, assault weapons in the house? What am I saying? I'm saying that our behavior is not normal. So when we go into communities where they have a sense of decorum, they have some sense of peace, they have some semblance of order, and we come from environments, neighborhoods where disorder and chaos is the order of the day, there's inevitably always going to be a conflict. Whether that conflict means I'm crossing Western or Kedzie or Austin or Harlem, or whether that conflict means I'm going to another city that's unlike my hood, I'm always going to be at conflict where there's a sense of normalcy. And that's what we're not dealing with about ourselves, is that we've accepted the condition that our young people get to do what they want to do, how they want to do it, when they want to do it, and then we stand back, especially as men, and we have become afraid to impose order and discipline and respect on our children or our young men. And so with the last few minutes I have left, as I said, I know a lot of people may not appreciate this kind of talk. But I want to challenge the men out there. How much time do you spend in the community versus watching TV, playing a video game, going to the liquor store, going to the club, kicking it? How much time, those of you who have come from the street life, those of you who have come from the element, those of you who made a contribution to building a mob or a street organization, but now you stand back on the sideline and you let these young men run wild. You're afraid to speak up in your own community or in your own group that you have a legacy and a history with. I'm challenging all the men to step forward, because we don't have time to play. We're killing ourselves wholesale. We're killing ourselves relentlessly. We had over 17 or so murders in the last week and over 140 some odd people shot. Just in the last week, where are the men? Why are we more afraid of our youth than any other group of men on the planet? We're more concerned with our cars, our hair, our clothes, or chasing women than we are with being men who are responsible for the babies that we produce by the women that we chase and run down. So I know this is kind of hard for us to take. And some of you may misunderstand or choose to misunderstand where I'm coming from, but I know some of you can feel where I'm trying to go. It is time for black men to step up in this community. Why do you have to be paid to get out on the block and put order in your own neighborhood, clean your own neighborhood, preserve and protect the women and children and elderly in your own neighborhood? Why do you have to be paid to do that when women have been paying to take care of us since we have been of age, many of us? So, please think about these things. I want to encourage all of you, if you would like to get involved with the Street Peace Coalition, you can reach us here at our Facebook page or on our website. We're very serious about this mission and this work. We need serious men and serious women to come and help us propel this movement forward, because we're about saving one life at a time. I want to thank you for tuning in again to the Street Peace Coalition on Comcast 21. We will look forward to seeing you next week when our regular host, Johnny Cole Muhammad, returns. Thank you and God bless.